Welcome to Whispers and Tales, where stories come to life. Here, every tale is a journey, every whisper holds a secret, and each word will transport you to another world. Settle in, relax, and let the magic of storytelling sweep you away. Let's begin. In the late 1800s, Blackthorn was a small, quiet village nestled in the dense woods of northern England. The villagers lived simple lives: farmers, shepherds, and tradespeople. They rarely ventured beyond the thick forest that surrounded their homes, content to stay in the village that their ancestors had called home for generations. The village church was the center of the community, and Reverend Martin, an old but kind man, was beloved by all. But everything changed one stormy night in October. The night was colder than usual, and the wind howled through the tall trees, making the branches sway like skeletal fingers. A heavy fog settled over the village, turning familiar paths into a maze of shadows. The only light came from the flickering lanterns that hung outside the cottages. The villagers gathered in the church, sheltering from the storm. They whispered among themselves, uneasy and tense. Reverend Martin led them in prayer, hoping to calm their fears. But suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the church. A tree had fallen just outside, striking the ancient graveyard. It was then that they noticed a single grave had been split open. The grave belonged to a man named Jonathan Crowley, who had died nearly 50 years earlier under mysterious circumstances. He had been an outsider, a traveler who had come to Blackthorn seeking refuge. No one knew much about him, only that he had been found dead in his home one morning, his face frozen in a scream of terror. The villagers gathered around the broken grave, staring at the open coffin. But it was empty. A sense of dread settled over the crowd, and they hurried back to their homes, locking their doors and windows tightly. That night, no one slept. Over the following days, strange things began to happen. Livestock vanished without a trace, leaving only bloodstains in the dirt. The crops withered overnight, and the well water turned murky and foul. At night, the wind carried strange, distant whispers that no one could quite understand. Some claimed to see shadows moving among the trees, darting just out of sight. Others spoke of hearing footsteps behind them, but when they turned, no one was there. A feeling of unease settled over the village like a thick, choking fog. People stopped leaving their homes after dark, and the once lively village square grew empty and silent. Reverend Martin was worried. He visited each house, offering comfort and prayers, but his voice was strained, and his eyes were tired. Whatever had come to Blackthorn, he could not keep it at bay with words alone. One night, Sarah Harper, the widow who lived at the edge of the village, vanished. Her house was left open, and a trail of muddy footprints led from her doorway into the woods. The villagers searched for her in vain, but the woods were vast and treacherous. All they found was her lantern, lying broken near the ancient oak that marked the edge of the village. Fear gripped the village. People began to whisper that Jonathan Crowley's spirit had returned to take revenge, though none could say for what. Some suggested that he had been wronged, buried without a proper blessing. Others thought that the storm had awakened something older, something evil that had been lying in wait beneath the earth. Weeks passed, and the situation only grew worse. Children began to fall ill with strange fevers, crying out in their sleep about dark shapes and ghostly faces. Doors that had been locked were found wide open in the morning, and the smell of decay hung heavy in the air. The crops were ruined, and hunger began to gnaw at the village. Then, one Sunday, Reverend Martin did not appear for the morning service. A group of men went to his cottage, but it was empty. The fire was cold, and his Bible lay open on the table, its pages torn and blackened. In the middle of the room was a single muddy footprint, too large to be human. The villagers gathered in the church, frightened and desperate. They prayed and begged for help, but the church felt different now, darker, colder, as if something watched them from the shadows. That night, a terrible scream echoed through the village, followed by a deep, rumbling growl that shook the very earth. The villagers locked themselves in their homes, waiting for dawn, but dawn never came. The sky remained a dull gray, and a perpetual twilight settled over Blackthorn. It was then that they realized they were trapped. Whatever curse had befallen the village, it would not let them leave. On the third day of endless twilight, a stranger came to the village. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that hid his face. He carried a long walking stick and moved with a slow, deliberate pace. The villagers, desperate for any hope, gathered around him, asking who he was and why he had come. "I am only a traveler," he said, in a voice that was calm and cold. "I heard tales of strange happenings in Blackthorn and came to see for myself." The villagers begged him to help, and he agreed to stay the night in the church, saying that he would confront whatever darkness haunted the village. He did not seem afraid, and his calmness gave them a small measure of comfort. That night, the stranger lit a dozen candles in the church and stood before the altar, waiting. The villagers watched from their windows, praying that he would succeed where they had failed. At midnight, the church bells began to toll of their own accord, and a terrible wind swept through the village, snuffing out the candles. A low, menacing laugh echoed through the night, and the ground trembled. The villagers covered their ears, terrified. The stranger did not move. He stood tall, his eyes fixed on the darkness that gathered at the far end of the church. Suddenly, a figure appeared. A shadowy man, taller than any human, with eyes that glowed like embers. It moved closer, its voice a hissing whisper that seemed to come from every corner of the room. "Why do you come here, stranger?" the shadow asked. "This place belongs to me." The stranger raised his walking stick, and a bright light erupted from its tip, driving the shadow back. The villagers gasped as the church shook, and the shadow let out a terrible, inhuman scream. It was then that they saw the face of the shadow, twisted, contorted with rage and hatred, the face of Jonathan Crowley. The stranger spoke, his voice steady and clear. "You have no power here, spirit. Leave this village or I will force you back to the grave." The shadow snarled and laughed. "I will leave, but only if you give me what I desire." "What do you want?" the stranger asked, lowering the stick slightly. "The souls of the villagers," Crowley's spirit hissed. "They belong to me, promised long ago. They owe a debt, and I have come to collect." The villagers, horrified, begged the stranger not to listen, but he remained calm. "You have no claim over them," he said. "They are innocent of whatever wrong you suffered." The shadow seemed to grow larger, darker. "Then you will face my wrath," it whispered, lunging at the stranger. A fierce battle erupted, the church filled with blinding flashes of light and shadow. The villagers could barely see, but they heard the stranger's voice, chanting strange words in a language they did not understand. With a final burst of light, the shadow was gone. The villagers rushed to the church, finding the stranger on his knees, his face pale and drawn. He looked up at them and spoke in a tired voice. "It is done," he said. "But the darkness is not gone. It will return unless the truth is brought to light." The stranger told the villagers that the only way to break the curse was to dig up the truth, the real story behind Jonathan Crowley's death. He warned them not to trust what they thought they knew, for the truth had been buried along with Crowley's body. With heavy hearts, the villagers returned to the graveyard. They dug through the muddy earth, deeper and deeper until they found an old chest, buried beneath the roots of the fallen tree. Inside were letters, written by Jonathan Crowley himself. The letters told a story of betrayal and murder. Crowley had been wronged by the villagers' ancestors, accused of a crime he did not commit. He had been killed in secret, his death disguised as an accident and buried without a proper blessing. The village had prospered ever since, but the debt remained unpaid. As the truth was revealed, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and a terrible wail rose from the graveyard. The sky darkened, and a cold wind blew through the village. The curse was coming to claim its due. The stranger stepped forward, holding the letters high. "You have your truth," he shouted. "Let them be free." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the darkness lifted, and the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds. The village was silent, the air fresh and clear. The stranger left the next day, refusing to stay even for a meal. He did not say where he was going, only that his work in Blackthorn was done. The villagers thanked him, offering him what little they had, but he took nothing. As he walked away, the village began to heal. The crops grew again, the well water ran clear, and the children recovered. But they never forgot what had happened, nor the lesson they had learned. Jonathan Crowley's grave was restored, and the letters were placed in the church as a reminder of the past. Reverend Martin never returned, and a new priest was brought in to bless the village once more. But the villagers knew that some debts could never truly be paid, only remembered.